March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Teachers March. Every generation has issues that define them. When injustice, marginalization, and fear of an uncertain future arise, people stand up. Social media platforms have allowed folks to shine light on issues in a way that simply wasn't possible a decade ago. They can be a great equalizer when fighting powerful institutions that have historically had a stranglehold on the narrative. While activism born on social media has facilitated real social change, it is not without criticism. Some say social media makes people lazy. A tweet of defiance or dissent does not in itself create change. Getting into an argument on Facebook feels like you're standing up for something, but with no action comes no change. People call this slacktivism. Do hashtags and retweets really make a difference? Today's show takes a deep dive into activism in the age of social media. My name is Chris Morandi, and this is Old Cove Road.
If I told you what I'm really thinking, you wouldn't listen for long. Yeah, you'd ask me if I'd been drinking. No, I tell you, you couldn't be more wrong.
So I was somewhat torn on this issue. My cynical side wants to embrace the idea of slacktivism and chalk it all up to a lot of people shouting about issues like they are road raging in a traffic jam. The argument on the other side, though, is pretty convincing. Seeing people come together in large numbers to fight for what they believe in is pretty powerful. While doing a little reading on this topic, I ran into an article by Dr. Nolan Cabrera. His piece was called Activism or Slacktivism: The Potential and Pitfalls of Social Media and Contemporary Student Activism. In his article, Dr. Cabrera talks about 10 things that he's learned from his research so far. He contends that activism involves an intentional, sustained connection to a larger group. It involves developing and exercising power. Social media activism can be both good and bad. Just because you're online, however, does not entail activism and could fall into the category of slacktivism. Dr. Cabrera states that to be an activist is a description of behavior as opposed to an identity. It involves a degree of risk and a clear vision of what social progress looks like. In other words, it's a lot more than hashtags and retweets. After his article posed more questions for me than provided answers, I reached out to him, basically asking him to tell me everything that he knows. He was kind enough to entertain my questions. The first thing I did was ask him several questions at the same time. But basically, what is activism and how do you do it?
In the scholarly literature, there's numerous discussions of how activism is done, the different repertoires and styles that activists engage in. But at its core, we were really having difficulty nailing down what exactly is activism. If we had to give sort of a definitional idea. And so that's why we offered the 10 theoretical premises at the end of the article. And it's not to say that this is all encompassing about what activism is at its core, but it really, in many respects, the activism that we were exploring was in many respects sort of in opposition to the slacktivism. That is that, slacktivism can be seen as a very narcissistic form of engagement. You're not necessarily politically effective. Saturday Night Live did just a brilliant job of satirizing this, but it was this brilliant satire where it was this celebratory song for, I think the guy's name was like Dave or Steve, very generic guy. And, it's like, he saw, he's sitting on his couch and saw a Black Lives Matter protest, thought it was wrong, tweeted about it, and cured racism. Thank you, Dave. And of course it's not as simple as that, but it does highlight a deeper issue that, in a digital age, that a number of people have deluded themselves to thinking that they're more politically effective than they actually are. And so the activism starts to get to the underlying question of how do we actually facilitate social change, where slacktivism is more about how do I make myself feel good in this situation.
Yeah. So do you think in general social media activism is good or bad?
Well, that's an impossible question to ask because, it's such a reflection of ourselves on this online media. And so, it's just like people. There's sometimes where it's amazing and great, and sometimes where you're like, I can't believe that we would stoop to such depths of inhumanity. Yeah. But I think that on the one hand, that a lot of the major national movements have a very strong and intentional online strategy in order to advance their specific causes. There is a little bit of differentiation in that they are investing a lot of resources in there, and so the smaller organizations, the smaller activist organizations, aren't going to be as wholly invested online. It's not to say that they've divorced themselves, but they don't do as many of the large-scale campaigns like the two that you just previously mentioned.
Right.
I think sort of a little context was necessary because my colleagues and I who wrote the article together, we were really we were consistently hearing about slacktivism, mm-hmm. Very casually thrown around, and it was interesting to hear that to sort of look at some context about where a lot of these denouncements were coming from, mm-hmm. And a really central focal point was Malcolm Gladwell's piece on slacktivism. Mm-hmm. Where he essentially offered up this thing called the replacement thesis, where because I'm engaging in this, I like this campaign or I did this, that it's sort of preventing me from doing this other online actual meaningful engagement. And I was concerned because then he would go and say, well, what happened to the freedom riders of the 1960s? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, that's an apples and oranges comparison, Mm-hmm. Like if we want to do the 1960s, okay, fine. There were plenty of people who were not necessarily of an activist orientation who boycotted grapes to support the United Farm Workers, and that would be considered maybe slacktivism. You're just kind of supporting a cause. You're just a drip in the bucket, but you're not necessarily an activist. Mm-hmm. And so in some respects, I think that the professions of slacktivism have actually been a little blown out of proportion. The other issue is that a lot of people have been pushing back because using the term slacktivism because there was this promise that the internet was going to be this democratizing sphere, that it was, that it doesn't matter where you come from, as long as you have internet access, you can participate in this, national and global democracy, mm-hmm. not have to be beholden to the major news, the major television networks. And as we found really quickly, those utopian visions didn't come to fruition. If people start deriding, the internet is just, following Kim Kardashian's selfies on Instagram, and but again, it's pushing back against that utopian vision that was sort of a Pollyannish pronouncement in the first place. And so it's sort of like the straw person argument, like it's all slacktivism. Well, no. There's a lot more nuance in these situations. That is that, online engagement offers activists a new venue, a more democratic sphere, not an entirely democratic sphere to do their work, and can be a really important tool in trying to promote social change and greater social equity. And just because it doesn't realize this utopian vision doesn't mean necessarily that it's bad. It's, like I said before, it's sort of reflective of our inherent flaws and limitations of being human.
Yeah. Can you think of an example of a movement or something that has happened recently that would not have taken off, something that would not have been brought to light if it wasn't for social media?
Well, I think Black Lives Matter is a great example of that. There was an incredible national moral outrage when you start seeing these, unarmed black men being killed, and especially when you have bystanders bystanders showing video of it, and or a body cam showing it, or a dash cam showing it, mm-hmm. and then those videos can go viral. That creates. I mean, let's not pretend that unarmed black men they were only getting killed now.
Right.
It's not this. This has been occurring for a very, very, very long time. It's just now that that these stories can get into the masses, and people actually have to grapple with what does this mean. Like, it's a lot easier. When you see, say, a newspaper article that describes the event. And if you sort of believe in the goodness of police or of neighbors, that this guy must have been doing something to threaten to threaten this person, and then all of a sudden you see the actual video of what's happening, and it begs a really difficult question: like, what else could this guy have done differently? And in a lot of cases, it's nothing. Like, this person was literally, they've had the phrase "driving while black" for a very long time, and mm-hmm. People are, it's overly simplified. In some instances, it's not. It's very accurate and reflective of it, and you start, you actually see an actual human person. Like, this is actually happening, not to some abstraction that you've constructed in your mind, but this is actually happening to a person. And then that is extremely powerful in terms of bringing attention to something that for a long time has been really swept under the rug.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. So what do you think about, so I'm a therapist, and when I work with people, I talk about two different aspects of what we're doing. The first is problem identification, which is like, what's going on? Let's wrap our heads around how we're feeling and what's going on. And then the second part is problem solving. What are we going to do specifically to work on these issues? I feel like social media is a lot of problem identification. It's a lot of people shouting about problems, those kind of things, and maybe not a lot of solutions. Do you think shouting about the problem or talking about the problem makes any difference?
You're 100% correct that the moral outrage doesn't do anything to promote the solution that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. But in many respects, that moral outrage is a display of power. Mm-hmm. The sort of, a lot of people have, and I'm not presuming on you, I'm just saying sort of as the in the general discourse, a lot of people have sort of an inverted idea of how this occurs. And I love Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, mm-hmm. Because he was saying that he was actually fiercely critical of the more moderate black preachers who would continually say, no, don't take to the streets, don't agitate, negotiate first, and then do your direct action. Mm-hmm. And he made the argument that because we have not made a display of collective power, we don't even have a place at that table. That is, that the agitation, the disruption, the direct action that he was talking about leads to the ability to negotiate. And so in some respects, you're right that the moral outrage doesn't do anything in terms of promoting the solution immediately. What it does is it gets different people at the table having these discussions. Whereas in the absence of that outrage, there wouldn't be, they wouldn't even be able to get to the solution point of it. Yeah. Because of, it's sort of that idea of like the most powerful thing you can do when someone says, "What do you think about me?" is say, "I don't." And that's right. What a lot of activists have come up against is that, oh, here's our issue. Okay, we'll get to that later. And then all of a sudden the issue is gone.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of issues, if there's something going on in my life or something going on in my community that I find troubling or something that I would like to change, how might I go about becoming an activist? How might I go about engaging and working on issues that I want to change?
The rapper Immortal Technique had a great quote where you said that no one person can do everything, but everyone can do something. Mm-hmm. And I really like that, in the sense that when you study different social movements, that there are people. Of course, there are like your direct action, hardcore activists. Activists to their core, but you have people of all walks of life participating. You have, like Cesar Chavez had a doctor who would watch after him while he was fasting. There would have to be a legal strategy. Out of the farm workers movement also spawned Teatro Campesino. So you had like this artistic movement that was part of it as well. And so the point being that, I guess the first thing is you need to know what it is that you have to offer. Like, what can you actually do, And if you don't necessarily have a discernible skill set that's valuable to this group, then just be, then it's fine to be person power, You're doing leafletting, calling, campaigning, whatever. But I think that the biggest issue is number one, making sure that you're connected to a larger collective. Because as we mentioned in the article, a social movement of one is not a social movement at all. That doesn't do anything. It's, this whole notion of I individually by myself, it's speaking truth to power, is one of the most narcissistic misnomers in our time. It's like, okay, fine. It's less about speaking truth to power, and almost like, Don Quixote fighting the windmills. It's like, yeah, I'm fighting the good fight, but what are you actually fighting? And so, the idea is then you have to be connected to a larger collective, and then also will keep you going in the process, but making yourself available. And then the other thing, and this is more something that I see, especially on college campuses, for people who have just started to, get an issue that they're interested in. Their eyes are opened, and that moral outrage really starts to fuel deeply in their heart and their soul. I think it's really important to understand that, first of all, that social change takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and no matter what the moral outrage, you're not going to change it tomorrow, because we didn't come to these conditions just out of the blue. They've been structured over years, decades, and even centuries. And also, if you're just starting out, please stay in your lane. Like, people, be respectful of the people who have been doing this. And actually, I hate to say this, it's to a lot of my male budding activists who come in and think that they have to. There is a very strong gender dynamic to it, where we're going to put on a rally. Well, I should be a speaker. Well, you've only been here a couple of months. Mm-hmm. Have respect for the people who've been doing the work and actually putting in the effort over the long term. As you continue to develop, your number will be called, but you shouldn't expect that immediate gratification, because that it essentially devolves into that slacktivism. Like, well, they weren't going to hear my voice, so I'm going to pack up and leave. It's like, that's, there's a lot of little wars of personality that go on in these situations. And so if you're really committed to an issue, be willing to put in the grunt work that doesn't go, that nobody recognizes. And I think also part of that is sort of the inverted way that we learn history, in the sense that, not to take anything away from great leaders of our past, but Malcolm X, Dr. King, Cesar Chavez, Huey Newton, any one of these people. But in some respects, it wasn't that this individual made the movement. Rather, this movement made the historical memory that we have of these individuals. And again, it doesn't take away from their historical legacy, but we need to remember that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of person hours that went into Selma, that went into the Great Boycott, that went into, whatever issue we're talking about. And those person hours, those people standing outside of the grocery store saying, hey, please boycott grapes, their contribution is extremely important, and we'll never know their names. Mm-hmm. And so as people are engaging in a social change, they have to be willing to basically say, okay, if my name is never written down in the history books, I'm okay with that. And because I'm still this is part of me being engaged in this participatory democracy and really trying to agitate for a more equitable society. If that's where you are at your core, you'll know that you're there because you don't have to have your contribution recognized.
Very well said. Well, Dr. Nolan Cabrera, thank you so much for coming on Old Cove Road. There's a lot to talk about, especially these days, about activism and kind of the stuff going on in our country and in our world right now. So we may have to have a part 2 of this conversation. But thank you so much for coming on Old Cove Road.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you. This is, and I was able to listen to one of your earlier podcasts, and it was cool to hear divergent views just on social media. So keep up your work, and thanks for inviting me. And so if we have a part 2, let's have a part 2.